If this story of loss and rebirth in wildland moved you, give us your heart with a like. Each pulse is a heartbeat shared with Clara and Caleb. And now, tell me, how do you think this story of the forgotten sister and the soldier with sad eyes will end? Share your voice in the comments. Your story also deserves to be heard. Clara Mallory had always existed in the margins of her own life. At 24, she had grown accustomed to occupying the spaces others left empty, to moving through the world like someone asking permission to breathe. Her hands, small but firm, had become expert at mending what others broke, at organizing what others disordered. She was the forgotten sister, the faint shadow that followed the blinding glow emanating from Lillian. That spring afternoon, while carefully folding freshly washed clothes, she heard her father's shouts from the study. The yellowed envelope that had arrived that morning now rested on the table, its contents revealed. Money for passage to Wyoming. Lillian's voice rose like a flock of frightened birds. "I can't go. I won't bury myself alive in some God-forsaken ranch. Samuel Prescott has invited me to the spring dance. He owns the finest store in town." Clara remained motionless, her fingers gripping a white sheet as if it were an anchor. The silence that followed weighed more than all the spoken words. Then, her father's footsteps echoed down the hallway until they stopped in front of her. His eyes, worn by disappointment, looked at her directly for the first time in months. "Clara," he said in a harsh voice, "you will go in your sister's place." It wasn't a question. It never had been. Decisions in the Mallory house were made like stones are carved, with dry, irreversible blows. That night, while the moon drew silver shadows on the wooden floor, Clara unfolded the letters that Lillian had exchanged with Caleb Hartwell for 6 months. She read them one by one, absorbing every word, every promise. The man's handwriting was surprisingly delicate for someone who, according to what he said, tamed wild horses and had survived the Civil War. Clara looked at herself in the small cracked mirror hanging over her dresser. She didn't see Lillian's vibrant beauty, nor her golden curls, nor her perfect lips. She saw brown eyes that kept secrets, a mouth that rarely smiled completely, and hands that knew the value of work. She wondered what Caleb Hartwell would see when he found himself before her, expecting to meet the woman from the letters, only to discover she was the wrong sister. Fear coiled in her stomach like a hibernating snake. But beside it, as faint as the first star at twilight, something else shone, the possibility of a life that would truly be hers. 5 days by stagecoach, 5 days of dust infiltrating every fold of her dress, of jolts that threatened to undo the seams of her resolve. Clara watched the landscape gradually transform, the ordered, familiar fields giving way to wild plains, infinite horizons that seemed to swallow all certainties. In her lap rested the small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. It contained no photograph, only a lock of brown hair identical to her own. "To remind you who you are," her mother had told her before the illness took her away. Clara caressed it like a talisman, an anchor in the ocean of uncertainty she was navigating. The other passengers looked at her with occasional curiosity. A single young woman traveling alone to Wyoming could only mean one thing. She was going to meet a future husband, probably a marriage arranged by correspondence. Poor creature, she had heard an elderly lady murmur, so plain, without the beauty that softens a frontier man's heart. Clara pretended not to hear, but the words lodged within her like small glass splinters. She clung to the exterior landscape, to the sky that grew vaster with each mile, as if in its immensity she could dissolve the person she had been until then. The last night, in a rustic inn on the outskirts of Laramie, Clara took out paper and pen. She began to write a letter to Caleb Hartwell, an anticipated confession. The words flowed like a melting stream, direct, cold, inevitable. She would tell him the truth as soon as she arrived, that she wasn't Lillian, that she had been sent as a replacement, that she would understand if he... She left the pen suspended. Over the paper, if he what? Rejected her? Sent her back? To where? There was no turning back now. Clara folded the unfinished letter and stored it in her bag. Some truths had to be delivered looking into the eyes. That night, Clara barely slept. The Wyoming wind sang against the inn's windows a strange melody, like an omen. It wasn't a lullaby nor a warning. It was simply the sound of an unknown world waiting for her, indifferent to her fears, her hopes, the person she had been until then. At dawn, with the silver locket pressed against her chest, Clara boarded. The last stretch of stagecoach. Her destination now had a concrete name that the driver had pointed out in the distance: Broken Arrow Ranch. The ranch emerged from the landscape like an incomplete prayer, solid, simple, surrounded by the untamed vastness of Wyoming. It wasn't the miserable cabin Clara had feared, nor the paradise that Lillian's letters had fantasized. It was simply real, like the mountains silhouetted on the horizon. When the stagecoach drove away, leaving her alone with her suitcase and the dust of the road, Clara felt time expand. Each beat of her heart marked an eternal second. A few meters away, a man emerged from the stable, tall, with broad shoulders shaped by years of hard work, dark hair cut practically. Caleb Hartwell. His eyes, the color of sky before a storm, studied her with an intensity that made her tremble internally. "Miss Lillian?" he asked in a deep voice. The moment had arrived. Clara felt the weight of the lie she hadn't even begun to weave, crushing her like a stone slab. "No," she responded, her voice firmer than she expected. "I'm Clara Mallory, Lillian's sister." She watched as recognition, followed by confusion and then something more complex, crossed the man's face. He didn't speak, just looked at her. Waiting for an explanation she hurried to offer. Lillian decided not to come. She decided to stay, and my father determined that I should honor the commitment. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "I'll understand if you want me to leave. I don't intend to deceive you." The silence that followed seemed to extend to the mountains and return. Caleb took a step toward her, and Clara resisted the impulse to step back. Not from fear, but because something in those gray eyes attracted and intimidated her at the same time. "You traveled 5 days to tell me the truth," he finally asked, with a tone Clara couldn't interpret. A shadow of a smile, so brief she might have imagined it, crossed Caleb's weathered face. He took Clara's suitcase with a gesture that brooked no argument. "The guest room is prepared. You can stay until we decide what to do." It wasn't an effusive welcome, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was an intermediate space, like the ranch itself, neither here nor there, suspended between what could have been and what would be. As she followed Caleb toward the house, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. The truth was told. What followed, at least, would no longer carry the weight of deception. The room was simple: a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a dark wood dresser, and a window that framed the mountains like a living painting. Clara set her suitcase on the bed and allowed her fingers to trace the quilt, recognizing in the patches the silent language of female hands that had been there before. "My mother made it," said Caleb from the threshold, "before the fever took her away." Clara withdrew her hand as if she had touched something sacred without permission. "It's beautiful." "Dinner is at 6, he continued, ignoring the comment. "The kitchen is stocked. I'll be at the corrals until sunset." When she was alone, Clara opened her suitcase methodically. She placed her clothes, 3 simple dresses, undergarments, a knitted shawl, in the dresser. On top, she placed the silver locket and a small book of poems worn by use. She had no more possessions. Her previous life fit in a suitcase, and even so she felt light, as if she had left behind something heavier than material objects. She spent the following hours exploring the house. Each room revealed something about Caleb Hartwell: the tidy but sparsely furnished living room, the functional kitchen with dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the study with agriculture books and a detailed map of the ranch. There were no superfluous ornaments, no purposeless objects. It was the house of a practical man. Without thinking, Clara began to work. She swept the wooden floor, shook out the rugs, prepared a simple but substantial dinner. She wasn't doing it to impress. It was simply what she knew how to do, what her hands naturally sought like water seeks its course. When Caleb returned, he stopped at the kitchen door. The aroma of stew and fresh-baked bread filled the space. Clara turned, and for a moment they looked at each other like two strangers sharing an involuntary secret. "You didn't have to cook," he said, though his hungry eyes contradicted his words. "I needed to keep busy," she replied simply. Idleness makes me think too much. They sat in a silence that gradually lost its uncomfortable edge. Through the window, the sun sank behind the mountains, bathing the kitchen with golden light that softened the contours. Clara observed how Caleb's hands, large and calloused, held the spoon with unexpected delicacy. Hands that had written letters with surprisingly elegant handwriting. "Tomorrow I'll show you the ranch," he said when they finished. It wasn't an invitation but a statement of intent. "I need you to understand what kind of life this is before we make any decisions." Clara nodded. That night, lying under the patchwork quilt, she listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the wind between the boards, the occasional distant whinny, the creaking of the house settling. Sounds that were neither threatening nor welcoming, simply new, like the day that awaited her at dawn. The first light of dawn found Clara already awake, watching how the landscape gradually took shape, emerging from darkness like a photograph being developed. Wyoming dawned with brutal honesty. There was no softness in those mountains, no forgiveness in that immense sky that seemed to observe her. She dressed in her most practical dress and gathered her hair in a simple bun. Her hands, slightly rough from years of domestic work, moved with the precision of habit. The silver locket, as always, found its place against her chest, hidden beneath the fabric. Caleb was already in the kitchen when she went down, drinking black coffee from a chipped cup. He offered her one without words. Clara accepted it, surprised by the intense flavor that completely awakened her senses. "It's strong," she commented, unable to avoid a small grimace. "Like everything in Wyoming," he replied. And for the first time, Clara saw something close to a genuine smile on his lips. The tour of the ranch was a revelation. Broken Arrow wasn't small. It encompassed acres of pastureland for cattle, had a stream that crossed it like a silver vein, well-maintained stables and corrals where several horses watched their passage with quiet curiosity. "How long have you been here?" Clara asked as they walked along a fence that seemed to extend to infinity. 10 years. I bought it after the war. It was abandoned, almost in ruins." Clara observed his hands as he adjusted a loose board, hands that had rebuilt a place from its foundations, that had transformed abandonment into something productive. Hands that, she imagined, had held weapons before tools. "It must be satisfying," she said, "to create something of your own." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, as if reconsidering who she was. "It is. It's also lonely." The confession, simple and direct, floated between them like a leaf on the stream. It needed no elaboration. Clara understood loneliness. She had carried it with her like a second skin for years, living in Lillian's shadow. At midday, Jonah McCall arrived, the young cowboy who helped on the ranch. His clear eyes lit up seeing Clara, and his easy smile contrasted with Caleb's reserve. He offered her wildflowers he had picked along the way, with a gesture so innocent that Clara couldn't help but smile. "Welcome to Broken Arrow, Miss Clara," he said enthusiastically. "Finally, this place will have something pretty to look at besides cows." Caleb cleared his throat and assigned him tasks that kept him busy the rest of the day. Clara noticed the tension in his jaw, the slight hardening of his gaze. Jealousy or simple irritation at the distraction? That afternoon, while preparing dinner, Clara surprised herself humming. Her hands, which knew the rhythm of domestic tasks, found certain comfort in familiarity. But here, in this kitchen, with the aroma of dried herbs and evening light filtering through the windows, the work had a different purpose. It wasn't obligation, but choice. When Caleb entered, he brought with him a small bouquet of wildflowers different from Jonah's, more discreet, almost shy in their beauty. "For your room," he said, leaving them on the table. "This place needs something more than functionality." Clara touched the petals softly. "Thank you." The silence that followed had a distinct quality, as if something had begun to take root in the space between them. On the morning of the third day, a ramshackle but well-cared-for carriage stopped in front of the ranch. From it descended an older woman of robust build and grey hair gathered in a practical bun. Her eyes, however, gleamed with the liveliness of someone who has seen much of the world and decided to laugh at most of it. "Hattie Fletcher!" exclaimed Caleb, approaching to help her down with a basket covered with a cloth. "The same old Hartwell. the woman replied, handing him the basket with an imperious gesture. "I came to meet the bride who finally got you out of your den of solitude." Clara, who was watching from the porch, felt herself blush. Hattie studied her from head to toe with an evaluative but not unkind gaze. "So you're Lillian Mallory," she said, extending a calloused hand. "Clara," she corrected, taking her hand. "Clara Mallory, Lillian's sister." A spark of interest followed by understanding lit Hattie's eyes. She looked at Caleb with an arched eyebrow, but he was already heading toward the house with the basket. "Interesting," Hattie murmured. "Very interesting." During lunch, meat pie and fresh vegetables that Hattie had brought from her own garden, the conversation flowed with surprising ease. The woman lived 13 miles away, on a smaller ranch she had maintained, alone since her husband's death 12 years ago. "Samuel Fletcher was a good man," she said, serving herself another portion. "But when he left, I discovered I was a better rancher than he ever was." Her laughter, deep and sincere, filled the kitchen like a blessing. When Caleb left to check a broken fence, Hattie leaned toward Clara, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "So they exchanged sisters, eh? And he knows?" "I told him as soon as I arrived," Clara replied. "I couldn't begin with a lie." Hattie nodded approvingly. "Wise decision. No man builds a real life on pretenses, dear." "I don't know if we'll build anything," Clara confessed. "We haven't decided anything yet." Hattie's eyes gleamed with ancestral knowledge. "He's already decided, though he doesn't know it. I saw it in his way of looking at you when you don't think he's looking." Clara felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "He barely knows me. Sometimes we recognize what we need faster than what we want," Hattie replied, like someone sharing a universal secret. "And that man needs someone who sees the truth and speaks it, without adornments or disguises." Before leaving, Hattie took Clara's hands in hers. "I'll come every week, not because you need it, but because I think we'll do each other good." On the way back to the house, Clara stopped to watch how Hattie's carriage moved away, raising golden dust against the afternoon sun. For the first time since her arrival, she felt something settle inside her. It wasn't belonging, not yet. But perhaps it was the seed of what it could become. When she entered, she found Caleb in his study, bent over papers. Without looking up, he said, "Hattie Fletcher is the best person within 100 miles. Her friendship is worth more than any dowry." Clara leaned against the doorframe, observing his tense shoulders, his absolute concentration. "I didn't bring any dowry." Then he raised his gaze, and his eyes contained something Clara hadn't seen before. "You brought honesty. In Wyoming, that's worth more than gold." The days began to acquire their own rhythm. Clara woke with the first ray of sun, prepared breakfast while Caleb fed the animals, and then each immersed themselves in their labors. He on the ranch, she in the house that was gradually beginning to feel like her own space. Without having discussed it, they had established a truce, a tacit agreement of coexistence that didn't demand immediate definitions. It was a respite both seemed to need. She, to adapt to this new life. He, to reconsider what it really meant to bring a woman into his world. One afternoon, while Caleb repaired a saddle on the porch, Clara sat beside him with a mending basket. They worked in silence. The only sound was the needle-piercing leather and thread sliding through fabric. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but a shared one, like a language they both understood. "My father was a shoemaker," Caleb said suddenly, without looking up from his work. "He taught me to respect leather, to understand its strengths and weaknesses." Clara glanced at him sideways, surprised by this unexpected offering of personal information. "My mother taught me to sew when I was 6. She said a firm stitch could hold together a world that was fraying." Caleb's fingers stopped momentarily. "Wise woman?" "She was. She died when I was 12. Caleb nodded, understanding the loss without need for more words. "The Civil War took my father. Typhus in a prisoner camp." Clara left her sewing on her lap. It was the first time he had mentioned the war directly. "How long was he there in the war?" 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days, he replied, with the precision of someone who has counted each one. "Long enough to see things no man should see." His eyes, normally watchful, seemed to now look at something distant, an interior landscape Clara could only imagine. Following an impulse, she briefly touched his hand. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or offer verbal comfort, just that touch, light as a feather, a silent acknowledgement of pain. Caleb didn't withdraw his hand. For a moment, time seemed suspended, as if the world held its breath. "Sometimes," he finally said, "this place is the only thing that keeps me anchored to the present. The land doesn't judge, it only demands honest work." Clara then understood something fundamental about him. Broken Arrow wasn't simply a ranch. It was a refuge, a place to heal invisible wounds, and perhaps also a place to allow oneself to begin again. That night, Clara found on her pillow a small wood carving, a bird with extended wings, so delicate it seemed about to take flight. There was no note, nor was one necessary. It was a different language, one she was beginning to learn to interpret. She kept the bird next to her locket, two symbols of different worlds that now coexisted in her life. Before sleeping, she looked out the window toward the mountains, dark against the starry sky. They were imposing, but no longer seemed threatening to her. They were simply what they were, silent witnesses to all the stories unfolding at their feet. The first lights of dawn found Clara already awake, watching how the landscape gradually took shape, emerging from darkness like a photograph being revealed. Wyoming dawned with brutal honesty. There was no softness in those mountains, no forgiveness in that immense sky that seemed to observe her. The storm arrived without warning, as they often do in Wyoming. One moment the sky was clear, the next, it turned leaden, loaded with clouds that seemed to contain all the fury of the world. Clara was alone in the house. Caleb and Jonah had left early to check the cattle in distant pastures. The wind lashed the windows with invisible fingers, and rain began to fall like silver needles. Clara lit additional lamps to combat the sudden gloom and went to the study to look for replacement matches. That's when she saw it, a half-open drawer in Caleb's desk, where a bundle of papers peeked out like an interrupted confession. She hesitated, her hand suspended in the air. She didn't want to violate his privacy, but something in those papers called to Clara like a magnet. Finally, yielding to an impulse stronger than her modesty, she carefully extracted them. They were letters that had never been sent. Written with the same elegant handwriting as those Lillian had received, but completely different in content. These didn't speak of weather or cattle or practical descriptions of the ranch. These letters revealed the soul of the man who had written them. "Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night, drowning in memories of the war. The sound of gunshots never completely disappears. It hides, waiting, like a beast, crouched in the darkness of my mind. Only dawn in the mountains returns me to the present. The silence here is different from anywhere else. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. I wonder if anyone else could understand it, or if I'm condemned to hear it alone. Today I buried a calf that didn't survive birth. Its eyes, still closed to this world, reminded me how fragile everything we build is. Why do we keep trying, knowing that loss is inevitable? Perhaps because the alternative is a different kind of death." Clara read page after page, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. These were the real letters of Caleb Hartwell, the ones he had written for himself, or perhaps for someone he hadn't yet met. Someone who could understand both the words and the silences between them. So absorbed was she that she didn't hear the door open, nor the wet footsteps on the wooden floor. Only when a shadow fell over the pages did she look up to find Caleb at the threshold, soaked to the bone, his eyes fixed on the letters she held. Clara stood immediately, her cheeks burning with shame. "I'm sorry," she began, but the words dried in her throat. Caleb didn't respond. He removed his soaked hat and let it fall to the floor. His face was unreadable, a perfect mask. "I shouldn't have—" Clara tried again. "No," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones, thick, charged with exposed vulnerability. Clara carefully placed the letters on the desk and passed by him, heading to the door. But before she could leave, Caleb's hand stopped her, gently gripping her arm. He wasn't looking at her. his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Those letters," he began, and then stopped as if words were tools too crude for what he was trying to express. "They're beautiful," Clara said softly. "They're honest." Finally, Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes was something that resembled relief. "Maybe," he said in a voice barely audible over the storm's roar, "I was writing to the wrong sister all this time." That night the storm worsened, transforming into something primordial and furious. The wind tore off roof tiles, made the house structure creak as if threatening to undo everything human hands had built. Clara and Caleb had dined in a silence, charged with unspoken words, the confession of the letters floating between them like a ghost. Past midnight, a crash shook the house. Caleb burst into Clara's room without knocking, a lamp in his hand, his face tense. "The west fence has broken, the cattle will be scattering." It wasn't an invitation, but Clara understood immediately. She dressed hastily while he waited in the hallway. She didn't ask if she could help. She simply took the raincoat he offered and followed him into the unleashed night. The rain was a liquid wall, almost impenetrable. Mud clung to their boots, threatening to swallow them. Clara had never experienced such an elemental force, so devoid of mercy, and yet she pressed forward, one step after another, guided by Caleb's figure moving with the certainty of one who knows the land, even in its fury. They reached a stream, normally gentle, now converted into a raging torrent. Through the curtain of water, Clara distinguished the broken fence and beyond it the dark shapes of scattering cattle. "There!" Caleb shouted over the water's roar. "A calf!" Clara saw it then, a small creature trapped in a bend of the stream, fighting against the current that threatened to drag it away. Without thinking, she waded into the icy water. She felt the torrent's force trying to knock her down, but she held firm, advancing inch by inch. Caleb reached her, his eyes wide with astonishment and alarm. Together, fighting against the current, they reached the terrified animal. Clara's hands, firm despite the cold that numbed her bones, joined with Caleb's to lift the calf and carry it to shore. In the relative safety of dry land, they looked at each other, soaked, exhausted, united by an act of rescue that transcended words. Clara's hair, freed from its pins, fell in dark strands over her face. The rain washed the mud from her cheeks but couldn't erase the determination in her eyes. "It could have drowned," said Caleb, his voice mixing with the storm's roar. "So could you," she simply replied. "No one has ever," he began, but stopped, as if words were insufficient. Clara understood. No one had ever risked so much for something that mattered to him. No one had entered the storm by his side without being asked. The return to the house was a blur of effort and determination. Once inside, Clara lit the fire while Caleb tended to the trembling calf. They worked in silence, moving in an instinctive dance of efficiency and mutual care. When they finally sat before the fire, wrapped in dry blankets, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge. "Why did you do it?" Caleb finally asked, his eyes reflecting the flames. Clara looked at her own hands, still red from the cold. "Because it's what you do when something matters. You fight for it, even against the storm." Caleb nodded slowly, as if he had just understood something fundamental. "Tomorrow I'll go speak with the pastor," he said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion. "If you agree." Clara raised her gaze, meeting his. She didn't need to ask what he was referring to. The meaning floated between them, clear as the first ray of sun after the storm. "I agree," she replied, and felt that something inside her, something that had been waiting all her life, finally found its place. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, just as preparations for the wedding were advancing with the practical simplicity that characterized Broken Arrow. Hattie had helped Clara adjust a simple but elegant wedding dress. The pastor would come from town the following week. Jonah had built a wooden arch for the ceremony, decorating it with wildflowers. Clara recognized the handwriting immediately, elaborate curls and flourishes that contrasted with the ordinary paper. Lillian. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. The words leaped toward her like small venomous snakes. "Dear Clara," or should I say, usurper, "news of your imminent marriage to my suitor has reached me. How convenient it turned out for you that I refused to bury myself in that forgotten wasteland. But you made a mistake, thinking I wouldn't care. Caleb Hartwell sent me money, wrote to me for months, built hopes in me. He is my suitor, not yours. If he has any honor, I'll send you back as the substitute you are, and accept the original bride. Otherwise, you'll always live knowing you're the second course, the insignificant sister who only got the leftovers of my life. With fraternal affection, Lillian. Clara sat slowly on the porch, the letter crumpling in her fist. Silent tears began to slide down her cheeks, not so much from the cruel words, but from recognizing a truth she had tried to ignore. She would always be compared to Lillian. She would always exist in her shadow, even thousands of miles away. That's how Caleb found her when he returned from the fields, sitting motionless, with the crumpled letter in her hand and tears drying on her cheeks. Without words, she extended the paper to him. He read it quickly, his face hardening with each line. When he finished, Clara expected explanations, perhaps even doubts. But what Caleb did surprised her completely. He walked to the lit fireplace and, looking directly into her eyes, threw the letter into the fire. "There's no truth in those words," he said with a firm voice while the flames devoured the paper, converting poison to ashes. None. Clara watched how Lillian's letter was consumed, taking with it years of silent comparisons, of always feeling insufficient. "She's beautiful," she said quietly. She was always the one everyone looked at, the one everyone wanted. Caleb knelt before her, taking her hands in his eyes, normally reserved, burned with an intensity Clara had never seen. "Beauty that fades with time isn't what I seek," he said. "I've seen enough in this life to know that what lasts is on the inside, in the strength to face storms, in honesty when it would be easier to lie." He brought a hand to Clara's face, drying a tear with his thumb. "You're not a substitute. You're the woman who chose truth from the first moment, the one who entered rising waters without thinking twice. The only one," his voice broke slightly, "the only one who has read my true letters and didn't flee from what she found in them." Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. Lillian's words no longer seemed to have the same power. They were dissolving like the letter in the flames, replaced by a more solid, more real truth. "In a week you'll be my wife," Caleb continued. "Not because fate sent you instead of her, but because I choose you. Every day I choose you." Clara opened her eyes, meeting his. For the first time since she could remember, she felt truly seen, not as someone else's shadow, but as herself. Clara Mallory, with all her imperfections and strengths. "And I choose you," she replied, her voice finding new firmness. "Every day I choose you." The wedding was as simple as it was authentic. In the ranch's backyard, under the wooden arch that Jonah had built, Clara and Caleb exchanged vows in the presence of the pastor, Hattie, and Jonah himself. There was no ostentation or luxury, only the raw honesty of two people who had chosen to build a life together. Clara wore the dress Hattie had helped her adjust, ivory white, with discreet lace at the neck and cuffs. Her hair was simply gathered, adorned only with small wildflowers. Around her neck, visible for the first time, she wore her mother's silver locket. When Caleb saw her appear on the porch, his habitually reserved face transformed. It wasn't an open smile, he rarely smiled like that, but something deeper, a revealed vulnerability, a contained astonishment that spoke more than any exuberant expression. "You're beautiful," he said in a hoarse voice when she reached his side. Clara smiled, feeling a serenity she had never experienced. "And you look like a man who has found what he was seeking without knowing he was seeking it." The vows were brief but meaningful. They didn't speak of eternal passion or idealized love. They promised respect, companionship, honesty, and shared strength. They promised to be each other's refuge in the storms that would surely come when the pastor declared them husband and wife. Caleb took Clara's face in his hands with a delicacy that contrasted with his physical strength. The kiss they shared was like a sealed promise, a pact more powerful than any signed document. The celebration that followed was equally simple, a shared meal at the kitchen table, laughter resonating on the wooden walls, stories exchanged like precious gifts. Hattie told anecdotes of her own marriage, letting slip that true love isn't always easy but always worth it. Jonah proposed toast after toast, each more elaborate and emotional, until everyone, even Caleb, was laughing openly. At sunset, when their guests had departed, Clara and Caleb sat on the porch, watching how the sun painted Wyoming's sky with impossible colors. Their hands were intertwined, a gesture that had already become natural between them. "I never imagined this day," Clara confessed, her head resting on her now-husband's shoulder. "I never imagined belonging to some place, to someone this way." Caleb brought their intertwined fingers to his lips, kissing them softly. "You don't belong to me like a possession," he said. "You belong to me as I belong to you, freely, by choice." Night fell over Broken Arrow Ranch, enveloping the couple in a mantle of stars. For Clara, who had always lived in the shadow of others' expectations, it was like awakening in a world where she could finally breathe without asking permission. For Caleb, whose heart had remained entrenched behind years of self-imposed solitude, it was like rediscovering a part of humanity he thought forever lost. That night, when they finally became husband and wife in every sense, there was no shyness or shame between them. Their bodies, like their souls, met with the honesty that had characterized their relationship from the first day. In the intimacy of the room they would now share, they discovered a new language of caresses and whispers, of mutual vulnerability and shared strength. And while the moon ascended over the mountains, Clara understood she had found not just a husband, but a home in the deepest sense of the word. Summer brought with it a drought like few remembered in Wyoming. The stream that crossed the property was reduced to a trembling thread of water. The pastures, once green and abundant, turned yellow and brittle under a merciless sun. The sky day after day remained a pitiless blue, without the slightest promise of rain. Clara watched with concern how Caleb returned each night more exhausted, his shoulders carrying not only the weight of physical work, but also the responsibility of keeping the ranch alive. The cattle began to thin and water reserves diminished dangerously. "I'll have to take part of the cattle to town to sell them," Caleb announced one night, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We can't maintain them all with what we have." Clara nodded, understanding the difficult decision. "I'll go with you," she said, not as a question but as a declaration. Caleb's gaze softened. After 3 months of marriage, it still surprised him. The strength of this woman who had come into his life almost by accident and had become his pillar. The trip to town was long and dusty. When they finally arrived, dragging with them visibly weakened cattle, the disappointment was immediate. Prices had fallen. All the ranchers in the region faced the same drought. All were trying to sell. While Caleb negotiated at the auction corral, Clara went to the store to buy provisions. It was there she first heard the murmurs, the whispered words that stopped abruptly when they noticed her presence. The wrong sister, the shadow of beautiful Lillian. Clara felt the ground move beneath her feet. How had the echoes of her story reached here? Who had spread those poisonous words? With the dignity she had learned to cultivate, Clara finished her purchases and left the store with her head high. But the words had hurt her more deeply than she wanted to admit. All her old fears, all the insecurities she thought she had left behind returned like a flood. She found Caleb at the saloon where he had gone to seal the deal with the cattle buyers. As soon as she entered, she noticed the sudden silence, the curious glances, the air charged with barely contained gossip. A corpulent man, with the liquid courage that whiskey grants, leaned toward Caleb. "They say they sent you the ugly sister, because the pretty one didn't want to come. Is it true you settled for the leftovers, Hartwell?" The silence that followed was absolute. Clara, paralyzed at the door, felt time stop. Before she could react, Caleb stood with deliberate slowness. His voice, when he finally spoke, resonated throughout the saloon with cutting clarity. "I chose the woman who has the courage to face storms by my side," he said, looking directly at the provocateur. "Beauty fades with time. Strength doesn't." Then, without another word, he crossed the room to reach Clara. He took her hand, and together they left the saloon, leaving behind stunned silence. That night, in the inn room, Clara finally let out the tears she had contained all day. How did they know? Who told them our story? Caleb held her against his chest, his hands caressing her hair with tenderness. It doesn't matter. Gossip is like weeds. It grows without anyone sowing it. But I'll always be compared to her, Clara whispered. I'll always be the sister no one originally wanted. Caleb took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me well, Clara Hartwell. You are my wife, my companion, my strength. You're not anyone's second course. You're the woman I chose and would continue choosing every day of my life. In his eyes, Clara saw the absolute truth of his words, and something inside her, something that still clung to old wounds, began to heal. The drought continued relentlessly when they returned to the ranch. Despite the pain of having sold part of the cattle at miserable prices, there was certain comfort in being back home, away from curious gazes and malicious words. Clara immersed herself in work with renewed determination, as if each drop of water, saved, each resource stretched to the maximum, was a small victory against adversity. Together with Caleb, they established a rigorous system to survive. They rationed water, fed the remaining cattle with carefully measured reserves, and watched, the sky hoping for clouds that never came. It was in the midst of this daily struggle when the unexpected occurred. An elegant carriage, completely out of place in Broken Arrow's dusty landscape, stopped in front of the house one afternoon. From it descended a figure Clara recognized immediately, despite years of separation. Lillian. Her sister was more beautiful than ever, dressed in an expensive traveling suit and a hat adorned with feathers. Her smile, however, had an edge Clara remembered too well. "Dear sister," Lillian exclaimed, extending her arms as if expecting an embrace. "What a touching rural scene. So this is where you ended up." Clara remained motionless on the porch, conscious of the dust on her work dress, the sweat on her forehead, the simplicity of her appearance compared to Lillian's artificial glow. "What are you doing here?" she asked simply. Lillian removed her gloves with a studied gesture. "I was curious. I wanted to see if the rumors were true, if you had really become Mrs. Hartwell, living in this place." The disdain in her voice was barely veiled. Clara felt a pang of pain, but also something new, compassion. Lillian, with all her beauty and expensive clothes, seemed somehow empty, like a perfect flower, but without fragrance. "This is my home," Clara replied with dignity. "And yes, I'm Clara Hartwell now." Caleb appeared then, drawn by the voices. He stopped beside Clara, his presence solid as a mountain at her side. Lillian observed him with interest she didn't bother to disguise. "So you're the famous Caleb Hartwell," she said, her voice changing to a honeyed tone. "I must say the letters didn't do you justice. You're much more impressive in person." Caleb didn't smile. His eyes, usually warm when looking at Clara, turned hard as granite. "Miss Mallory," he said with cutting formality, "your journey must have been long. May I ask what the purpose of your visit is?" Lillian laughed, an artificial sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Does a sister need a purpose to visit her dear family? Though I must confess I was also curious. I wanted to see if I had really lost something valuable by rejecting your offer." The insinuation was clear as crystal. Clara felt the air leave her lungs, but before she could respond, Caleb stepped forward. "You lost nothing, Miss Mallory," he said with a voice calm but firm, "because there was nothing for you here. If Clara had been the one who received my original letters, she would have always been my choice." Lillian seemed momentarily disconcerted, but recovered quickly. "How touching. I might almost believe it if I didn't know what it's like to live in Clara's shadow all my life. Always so serious, so insignificant." "Insignificant," Caleb repeated, and there was a dangerous tone in his voice. "Do you know what's insignificant, Miss Mallory? Judging a person's worth by their appearance. If you were my wife, this ranch would have already succumbed to the drought. What remains isn't what shines, but what builds." Lillian's face transformed, the mask of courtesy falling to reveal the bitterness beneath. "Enjoy your victory then, Clara. Enjoy this wasteland, while I return to civilization." Oh, by the way, Samuel Prescott and I will marry next month. A man with a real future, not just acres of dry land and starving cows. With those words, she turned on her heels and returned to the carriage, which soon disappeared in a cloud of dust. Clara remained motionless, her sister's words echoing in her ears. Part of her, the child who had always lived in Lillian's shadow, wanted to run, hide, maybe even cry. But another part, the woman she had become, Caleb Hartwell's wife, stood firm. That night, however, Lillian's visit had awakened old ghosts. While Caleb slept, Clara slipped out of bed and began to gather some of her belongings, moved by an irrational impulse to flee, to free Caleb from the burden she felt she was. It was then she felt his presence at the door. Caleb was watching her, his eyes full of understanding and something deeper. "You're not anyone's substitute," he said softly, approaching her. "You're my choice, my only choice." And in that moment, looking at this man who saw her completely, Clara finally believed, truly believed, that she was enough. More than enough. Autumn finally arrived in Wyoming, bringing with it the long-awaited rains. The earth, thirsty for months, absorbed the water like a blessing, and slowly the ranch began to recover. The fields turned green again, the stream sang again among the stones, and the cattle regained their strength. They had survived. Not only the drought, but something deeper. The doubts, the ghosts of the past, the comparisons that poison the soul. Broken Arrow Ranch emerged from the trial strengthened, as did the marriage that sustained it. On a particularly gentle afternoon, when the air smelled of wet earth and fulfilled promises, Caleb led Clara to the lookout in the mountains, the same place where months before he had confessed that perhaps he had been writing to the wrong sister all along. They rode in silence, enjoying the renewed beauty of the landscape, nature's generosity that after punishing returned to nurture. From the summit, the ranch looked small but solid, an anchor point in the immensity. The repaired fences, the rebuilt corrals, the house with its smoking chimney. Everything spoke of persistence, of the human capacity to remake what is broken. "I have something for you," Caleb said, taking a small package from his pocket. Clara opened it carefully, revealing a simple but beautiful ring with a small blue stone set in it. "I should have given it to you before the wedding," he continued, taking her hand. "But I wanted it to be special. This stone is from these mountains. Like us, it has resisted pressures and time, and has emerged stronger, more beautiful." Clara felt her eyes fill with tears as Caleb slipped the ring on her finger. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a happiness so deep it could only be expressed this way. "We've built something real here," she said, looking toward the ranch. "Something that is truly ours." Caleb nodded, following her gaze. "And we'll continue, building it, day by day, season after season." The sun began to descend, painting the sky with golden and purple tones. Clara rested her head on Caleb's shoulder, feeling his warmth, his solidity, the certainty of his presence. "Sometimes I think about that first letter," she reflected, "the one Lillian received, the one that started all this. If she had said yes, from the beginning, then I would have met the wrong woman," Caleb completed, gently kissing her forehead, "and I would never have discovered what it really meant to find a home in another person." Clara smiled, understanding the truth in his words. It hadn't been fate that united them, but the choices both had made. Lillian's choice not to come, Clara's choice to tell the truth from the first moment, Caleb's choice to see beyond expectations, and then, each day, both their choice to remain, to build, to believe in each other. As they returned to the ranch, under Wyoming's starry sky, Clara carried with her the certainty that she had found her place in the world, not as the forgotten sister, nor as a replacement, but as herself. Clara Hartwell, a woman who had learned that true beauty didn't reside in perfection, but in authenticity. And when Caleb helped her dismount in front of the house that was now undoubtedly her home, he whispered against her ear the words that sealed their pact, their daily choice. "Not because fate willed it, but because I chose you, always."